Recognize the Government House Leader.
They were covered in the law amendments. Mr. Chairman, would you please call Bill 107, the Prescription Monitoring Act?
Call Bill 107, the Prescription Monitoring Act. This bill has been amended. Seeing no interventions, questions been called. Shall the clauses as amended carry? Shall the clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? The bill is carried. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Would you please call Bill 115, the Maritime Provinces Higher Education Commission Act?
Bill number 115, Maritime Provinces Higher Education Commissions Act. This bill has no amendments. Shall the clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? The bill is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The next two bills are private members' public bills. Would you please call Bill 116, the Liquor Control Act?
Bill number 116, the Liquor Control Act. This bill has been amended. Shall the amendments clauses carry? Amended clauses carry? Shall the clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? Bill is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Chairman, would you please call Bill 121, the Motor Vehicle Act?
Bill number 121, the Motor Vehicle Act. This bill has amendments. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of my colleague who introduced this bill, the member for Halifax-Clayton Park, we're very pleased for the approbation and support from all members of the committee and indeed members of the House. It's a very constructive piece of legislation that will add and further the safety, particularly obviously we're speaking to the issue of children in this province, and certainly not only add to the safety component for children who are being transported and enjoy the company of their other family members and friends, but also, and I'm sure the government would agree with this, the significant savings to the Department of Health in healthcare cost and a number of other issues that tag along with this particular piece of legislation and the benefits that it will derive. So with that, we would certainly seek further approbation.
Thank you. Shall all the clauses as amended carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? The bill is carried. Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that your committee do now rise and report these bills.
Is it agreed? Agreed.
Bills reports that the committee has met and considered the following bills: 95, 101, 102, 107, 115, 116, and 121. And the chairman's been instructed to recommend them to the favorable consideration of the House, each without amendment.
Thank you.
When shall we be ready?
When shall the bills be read a third time? Future day. Okay. Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, would you please call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Would you please call Bill 131, the Police Act?
I'd like to call Bill number 131, the Police Act.
Mr. Speaker, in the absence of the Honourable Minister of Justice, perhaps I could read his opening remarks. He's in law amendments. Law amendments, correct. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to begin second reading debate of Bill number 131, an act respecting policing in Nova Scotia. This legislation supports Nova Scotians and their desire to have adequate and effective policing. Mr. Speaker, effective policing is one of those vital attributes of safe, strong communities, and my responsibility as Minister is to ensure an adequate, effective level of policing from one end of the province to the other. This bill, to a large extent, will solidify in law the good practices that have evolved over the past 10 years. Good governance is critical to effective policing. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police passed a resolution to that effect at its annual conference in British Columbia this summer. Our legislation supports this clear connection between governance and policing service. Bill number 131 better defines the roles and responsibilities of the Minister, Police Chief, and municipal police boards. And in those communities served by the RCMP, it authorizes the creation of police advisory boards. These boards would have similar roles to the existing municipal police boards. They would provide advice to the RCMP and their municipal councils on such matters as law enforcement and crime prevention. Policing must reflect community standards. That's where these new advisory boards can have a positive impact. Yes. Among some of the other changes, we are creating a Nova Scotia Police Review Board. This would merge the Police Commission with the existing Review Board. This is being done, Mr. Speaker, to make sure services are provided as efficiently and effectively as possible. We have been very careful to ensure that procedures for investigating and resolving complaints remain consistent with the principles of fundamental justice. This bill touches on other policing issues, including the power and authority of police officers, internal discipline procedures, the appointment of special constables, and the use of police badges on uniforms. We have spent the last several years consulting with our partners in policing. In particular, I will mention the Nova Scotia Chiefs of Police Association, the Association of Nova Scotia Police Boards, and the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities. I would also like to thank municipal police departments and our provincial police, the RCMP, for their input and guidance. Mr. Speaker, a modern police act supports modern policing. It will contribute to safer, stronger communities. I look forward to hearing other comments during second reading debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I move second reading of Bill number 131.
Recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to rise and speak on Bill 131, the Police Act and the comprehensive nature, which in fact this act has been redefined. It also sets out the role of advisory boards and with respect to the Nova Scotia Police Commission and with respect to how policing services shall be delivered across this province. The most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is we're coming to a day and age where policing services are integrated in such points whereby the RCM police carry out the same sort of role within the jurisdiction that was normally found by municipal policing services. And those jurisdictions are closely closing the gap, and the policing services do entwine themselves in the delivery of policing services that are designed to develop healthy and safe communities. And it's very important to know that many of us through this legislative assembly from one time or another has had issues from residents who have complaints sometimes about the way the policing services are delivered or the way that they've been treated by the policing service, and what is the role of the Nova Scotia Police Commission, what is the role. One time municipalities had their own police commissions, and as a matter of fact I served on the then former Dartmouth City Police Commission. Many of those complaints we would hear, and how to deliver the best services, hear about complaints as well as how to best deliver services to communities. We talked about community-based policing as a method of policing. We talked about the importance of developing a policing services whereby the single most important issue would be to develop safe, stable communities. And as I stand in this legislative assembly, I do recall just a couple of, I think it was about a month or so ago, where in fact the United States Armed Forces were informed about not going into certain neighborhoods because they weren't safe. And it often puzzles me as to why certain neighborhoods in municipalities are considered not to be safe. Why is it that certain communities are stigmatized? Communities such as, for example, and I don't want this to be implied that these are the only communities, but there are some communities like Gottingen Street, Dartmouth North, like Spryfield, like Caledonia, in Dartmouth as well. So these areas are stigmatized because of certain things going on in the neighborhood and the level of policing services that they don't have. And I think to have an advisory board, a committee whereby they're going to look at just what kind of a role policing services not only plays within the delivery of a police service, but what kind of a role does policing services play in the development of communities. And I mean working closely with the development office on how best to plan a safe community when in fact there are subdivisions being developed in communities. Do the police play an important role on that committee to see that if in fact the designing of that neighborhood and that community is consistent with a safe, secure neighborhood, and that it's going to be easily accessible to policing services so that they can police the neighborhood or the community? I think there are a lot of things in this Police Act that really has been defined and redesigned so that we can meet those particular issues in the future. And I want to say to the Minister of Justice, this is a piece of legislation that's long overdue. I know that they have talked to, I'm sure the minister has said the Nova Scotia Chief of Police Association, but I also know that there's a national body called the Canadian Chief of Police Association who addresses issues directly to the Minister of Justice on issues on what they believe are important issues that detract or defer the policing services from being able to be more aggressive, if I can use that word, more aggressive in its delivery of protection services to the community. I think that there's a whole issue around, that, and I don't know if in fact the Minister of Justice has gone so far as to feel out the national body of the Canadian Association of Chief of Police on this particular issue or not. However, it really isn't necessary because the Canadian Chief, the Nova Scotia Chief of Police Association has quite the extensive arm into the Canadian Chief of Police Association to deal with that. And I do know that I believe that a Mr. Edgar McLeod, who is from the Cape Breton Regional Policing Service, is in fact a member of that national body. And he fully is the president of that national body, I'm told, and that in fact he has brought many of the issues. There's a lot of issues and concerns in communities and neighborhoods around Young Offenders Act and how policing services deal with those. And I don't think the public of Nova Scotia is fully aware of just how the legislation works with respect to the protection of young offenders and the delivering of police services to communities on that very issue. It's important to note although this piece of legislation is before us today, and I didn't get the real chance now, Mr. Speaker, to fully digest the piece of legislation before us. And so I do know that it's all encompassing. And once again, I commend the minister for reaching out and talking to the Nova Scotia Chief of Police Association. I'm sure he had spoken to representatives of MAP, and he's probably spoken to which is the Municipal Association of Policing Services. And he's also probably spoken to PANS, the Police Association of Nova Scotia. So he's probably had tremendous input from the delivery of policing services, and he's probably had the tremendous input from the Nova Scotia Police Commission, along with other people who have been involved in policing services throughout the province. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, that he may not have had the kind of consultation with, in fact, many of the Nova Scotians on how the Policing Act should be changed. And often we look at the bureaucratic process of introducing legislation and to bring forward that kind of piece of legislation. Often we don't, it comes secondary that Nova Scotia citizens' participation falls in line, and it usually falls in line after the piece of legislation has been drafted and it goes on to law amendments. And many, many Nova Scotians to this day don't realize that they can be a part of making significant changes into legislation in the province of Nova Scotia. Although I believe that we are the only jurisdiction, or one of the very, very few jurisdictions, that allows citizen participation in legislation and allows the public to come before as witnesses to legislation to speak on it. Many Nova Scotians really don't know the valuable, are unaware of the opportunities that they have before them to put in to provide some valuable input into pieces of legislation. There's a whole host of issues around policing services, and unfortunately, as I have said, when I stand in this legislature, unfortunately, I have not digested this bill that's before us, Bill 131, the Police Act, in the kind of manner that I would have liked, and that is through no one else's fault but my own. But I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, and the government side, that this piece of legislation is yet to go across the floor, and it's yet to enter the Red Room, and there may be some individuals who will come as witnesses before law amendments to add some pieces with respect to this piece of legislation. The fact is that there's a whole new role and a new way of delivering policing services across this country. We can talk about community-based policing. We can talk about individual troop patrol. We can talk about certain squads and divisions, like the narcotics squad. We can talk about the prostitution squad. We can talk about special services squads that will come in. We can talk about individual policing services that are specifically designed to address particular community needs, all which, in fact, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, is enshrined in this piece of legislation that says how it will go about, how it will be reviewed, and how it will be assessed. Those are the kind of things that we need to know with respect to what's going on in legislation. And we need to be able to inform Nova Scotians with respect to that. I just want to harken back to now RCM policing services. As a matter of fact, I know now that one time there was a jurisdiction whereby if you escaped into the boundary of what was called the municipality, and it had a municipal police force, that you were almost assured that the RCM police wouldn't nab you, that somebody else would have to nab you. However, the jurisdictions have now changed. There's an integration of services that are provided by the RCM police and the municipal police services. Those integrations have taken place within the last few years, Mr. Speaker, and they have allowed the RCM police to be better utilized along with the municipal policing services on delivering programs that are compatible with each other. And those programs sometimes are in fact, not sometimes, but often are beneficial to the communities, because the community now knows that, you know, if there's a violation and the municipal police service is not available, that the RCM police can take over. They can come in and they can take over. So forget about your speeding and running into the municipality and hoping that the police, RCM police services can't nail you, because they can. To use the term being nailed for a violation, you know, they certainly can. So there's that kind of cooperative measure that has been taking place within the last couple of years. I want to say that I've watched some significant changes with respect to the delivery of policing services in the community, in the constituency that I represent. And I have to say that over the last couple of years, there's been a positive relationship with the policing services. I meet with them from time to time. I do know that the community has a district neighborhood watch, one of the largest in Nova Scotia. Neighborhood watch with a large group of individuals whom in fact have a police representative at their meeting and ask the police about a whole issue, a whole host of services. Many people, unfortunately, don't know their rights when in fact they are, in fact, have a challenge with policing services programs or the way an issue has been handled by the police department and so on. Some of them go right directly to, in this particular case, the HRM police. And then they find out that there's a further need, and they go to the Nova Scotia police commissioner, and they try to deal with this in a way in which they really don't have a handle on how best to represent themselves before the policing bodies. Hopefully, if there is an advisory committee, and there is the potential for an advisory committee, that the very first and fundamental role of that advisory committee will be able to advise citizens on how to go through the bureaucracy of policing services, and in particularly how to walk themselves through the Municipal Police Act, the new or the recommended changes to the Police Act, so that they can find themselves better served. Mr. Speaker, I had not intended to speak a whole lot on this piece of legislation, but I can assure you, if I were to have to, and to bring my notes together, I could certainly spend an entire hour on this very issue of policing and the important role the policing services plays in our society. But having said that, I will now take my seat and I'll wait for this bill to come back across this legislative floor and listen to maybe some of the presenters or witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak on this particular piece of legislation, the Nova Scotia Police Act. The amendments are good amendments. Just to compliment the Government House Leader on his opening remarks on behalf of the Minister of Justice. But there are a number of points that I think have to be made with regards to this, Mr. Speaker. First of all, we'd like to certainly compliment our policing service in Nova Scotia, right across this province. They are doing a phenomenal job. When we look at the issue of policing service in Nova Scotia compared to 20 or 30 years ago, we are effectively light years ahead of where we were back before some of the improvements that were made through the policing commissions, starting off at the local municipal policing commission services, and then eventually when a number of issues came up that necessitated the need for a provincial policing commission. And I think, like as in many different issues and jurisdictions of matter, improvements take time, and it's to paraphrase, that movie with Richard Dreyfuss. It's what they call baby steps, and it's very positive when we look at the high quality of policing service in Nova Scotia, both within many of the regional and municipal police forces and also with the RCMP. We're very fortunate to have that high quality of service. But Mr. Speaker, that having been said, I mean, these individuals and organizations, they can only do so much. They require the support of government, they require the resources to be able to get the job done, and they require the legislative and the legal framework to be able to make that a realization. It was very disturbing, Mr. Speaker, that earlier this year it was noted that the Canadian Institute for Health Information, their latest health indicators report that Nova Scotia has the dubious distinction of the highest crime rate, excluding traffic, east of the province of Manitoba. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not exactly what you call a ringing endorsement of success by the Minister of Justice in dealing with matters of crime in the province of Nova Scotia. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this report also shows that Nova Scotia has a substantially higher crime rate than that of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. And what have we seen the Minister of Justice provide to date? The only thing that's memorable that I can recall, Mr. Speaker, is the Minister of Justice providing a video for seniors on how to lock themselves in their own home. Well, is that the best that the Minister of Justice and this government can offer the people in Nova Scotia? The number of acts of violence that have been perpetrated, for example, as has been raised by the Leader of the Official Opposition with regards to taxi drivers in this province. I mean, it's gone right off the Richter scale, the amounts and the numbers of incidents of violence that have been perpetrated against servants who are trying to serve the public, individuals. I had occasion, the very day that issue was raised in the House here, I had occasion to take a taxi over to Dalhousie to that conference on youth for the Canadian Forum for Youth. And the taxi driver indicated that in the last 2 years, he had his leg broken, he had his jaw cracked, he had severe lacerations by 3 individuals, all over $5.50, all over one taxi fare. And all 3 of those individuals are up for facing before the judicial system. But that brings little comfort to those individuals that are out there providing that type of service. So, Mr. Speaker, I would think that the Minister of Justice would perhaps take a more active role in helping the policing service in this province to deal with these matters. For example, with regards to the particular piece of legislation that we already have in the books that's introduced. And I know there are certain limitations on debating these matters, Mr. Speaker, but the issue of binding arbitration for the policing services in Nova Scotia. That's a very important piece of legislation for these policing services, excepting HRM, which already has that particular matter built into its process of providing police service. So they already have binding arbitration. But I believe, Mr. Speaker, if we're looking for quality assurance for the people of Nova Scotia, I believe the government owes it to the people of Nova Scotia to ensure that policing service is considered an essential service. And binding arbitration would be part of that collective bargaining process. So we move to that next step. The Minister of Justice, when he was the justice critic on this side of the House, introduced that particular piece of legislation. Effectively, we've mirrored that and offered an olive branch to the government and to all members of the House to be able to come forth and proceed with that. It doesn't matter whose name is on the particular piece of legislation. Quite frankly, it matters little to myself as a labor critic, since it comes in under the Department of Labor. But if the Minister of Justice wants to do it, that's fine. If the Minister of Labor would like to do it, that's fine. If the member for Colchester North would like to do it, as someone who has a very close connection with policing services, that's fine. But, Mr. Speaker, this particular piece of legislation does add some additional improvement into the process, and I'm sure when the various stakeholders come before law amendments, they will have an opportunity to provide greater insights and perhaps some amendments, perhaps, you know, their objections if they have any, and so forth. But I don't think we should be just quietly and subtly cajoled into thinking that all these wonderful pieces of legislation are coming before the House and they're going to solve all the problems, Mr. Speaker. They're not. The incidence of violence in this province has increased under this government's watch. Now, whether they're wholly responsible or partially responsible or what have you, Mr. Speaker, the facts are the facts. The incidence of crime in the Cape Breton Regional Municipality has more than tripled in the last 4 to 5 years. And they can only do so much. They can only do so much, Mr. Speaker. They are limited by the resources and the support that they receive from the Department of Justice and the Minister of Justice. We are becoming quite concerned about this polarization that exists between the minister and the policing services at that level. The Minister of Justice can't continually to expound, you know, with platitudes about what's right and what's not right, but never get down into the practicalities of how to resolve the issues. It's just not good enough. Here in Metro, we've seen a proliferation of break and enters, particularly against senior citizens. And you yourself, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure on a previous day at a Public Accounts Committee meeting, you raised the concern about the effects of violence on seniors in this province. I mean, this has become a very high-tech business, you know, where some rather questionable elements will go out, they'll stake out a community, they'll drive out perhaps a day or two in advance, and they'll stake out certain numbers of houses and certain roads in certain communities, and they'll find, well, these folks aren't home today, and these are their travel patterns. They work, you know, they work during the day, or perhaps a certain day they go for groceries, or nobody's around for whatever reason. And then, of course, they set up a very elaborate network of communication using cell phones, using scanners, using people, operatives, in this very sophisticated style, so that if the owner decides to come home, particularly in a rural community of Nova Scotia, well, they'll see them five miles down the road. So that gives lots of lead time for the perpetrators to go in, either ransack the place, they can take whatever they want, with little regard, Mr. Speaker. So the policing services in this province need assistance from this government. They need more financial resources to be able to do their job, and they need more cooperation from the Department of Justice to act not only as a catalyst to make things happen, but as a facilitator. Show the leadership that's required to get the job done. They cannot do it on their own, Mr. Speaker. And I can give you numerous examples in my constituency where the disregard for life and limb and property, personal property, has become ever so pronounced. And what's even amazing, Mr. Speaker, are the number of break and enters in the daytime. One time, you know, it was under the cover of darkness. Now it's become, because they've become so sophisticated in the way that they perpetrate their crimes, that whether it's in the daytime or the evening, it doesn't matter. It's much easier because they can see where they're going and how they're going to get there, and they can monitor, you know, people's travel patterns. It's becoming unacceptable. And I would ask the Minister of Justice to be able to do something about it. Sure, we'll support the bill going on to law amendments. There are a lot of good things that can be done. But I would also take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to perhaps press the government to proceed with this issue of binding arbitration, because it not only provides that level of quality of service, but it's a comfort level. It's a comfort level for the people, particularly in rural Nova Scotia, in those jurisdictions where policing organizations have the ability to strike. It will allay the fears. It's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of not knowing, Mr. Speaker, that you are protected. I recall back in the early 1970s, perhaps it was around 1969, when there was a strike for the Sydney Police Department. Well, at 12:01, when they were legally entitled to go on strike, it was pandemonium in the city of Sydney. There were picture windows, there were storefront windows. It was amazing what had happened, Mr. Speaker. You know, the robberies, the violence, the property destruction. We don't want to see that anymore. Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity for the government to go one step further. Never mind delaying it till the 11th hour and then create the optics of doing something. Seniors can't afford to be locked in their own home. They cannot rely on a video on how to lock their door to protect themselves. That's not exactly what you call justice. Mr. Speaker, the amount of violence that's perpetrated even in our schools. I mean, it's almost getting to the point where, as we've seen several weeks ago, incidents of what almost became gang violence in one of the schools here in Metro. I mean, this is not what we've always known and believed to be a wholesome and safe environment for teaching our children. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, it's not just the issues that happen on that particular day, but what are the causes? What are the root causes of these incidents? And how is the government dealing with it? To date, the Minister of Justice is taking a hands-off approach to the growing incidents of crime and violence and robbery in this province. And they are doing very little to address it, Mr. Speaker. And it's time that the Minister of Justice come out of that little glass tower that he's down on Terminal Road and do something. There's not a day that goes by that you can't pick up any one of the major newspapers in this province and find a story that is about robbery or violence, drugs, narcotics, you know, the use of deadly force with guns and knives. It's on the increase, Mr. Speaker. And I know members of the Tory caucus, particularly many of the backbenchers, have voiced their concerns about this, and rightfully so. You know, concerns were raised about restorative justice. Well, I believe in restorative justice. But does it always work in every circumstance? No. I don't know. I don't have the background, the knowledge, or the statistical information to say yes or no. I've heard one of the members in the House say, no, it doesn't. And perhaps someone with more experience in that profession would be able to speak to this particular issue. But, Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned about the fact that the government is not doing enough to stem the tide of violence in this province. It's an issue that hasn't been raised extensively in the House. It's been raised, but when you consider the magnitude of this problem, I'm absolutely amazed how the government members have sat quietly. You know, they get up day in and day out and introduce resolutions, but nothing to deal with some of the major social problems and legal problems in this province, particularly in their own constituency. Why not? Are they restricted by the Minister of Justice? Yep. It would appear so. It would appear so. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very important piece of legislation. It's a good piece of legislation. But we just don't want more paper talk. We just don't want this, this make you feel good environment where everything is going along so smoothly and the government is introducing all this legislation that's going to create the problems or solve the problems. It's not. It's just not going to solve the problems. And I'm just absolutely amazed that how there's a lull of complacency on some of these major issues. And absolutely nothing, Mr. Speaker, is being said or done about them. And we have to think about the seniors, whether they're down in Meteghan or in Digby Neck or in Cumberland County or in Colchester County or in Halifax County, Cape Breton County, or wherever you want to go, Mr. Speaker. When are we going to start doing something about it? That's the question. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will certainly conclude my remarks and allow for further intervention by other members. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think I'll be brief compared to some of my colleagues who've spoken. I got to say that my biggest incentive, I guess, for getting to my feet on this act, Mr. Speaker, is just the way that the policing service affects our lives, and I think we always hope that it'll be in a positive way, and that when we need them, and we hope never, that they'll be there. And I think in particular the section on the police advisory boards I found to be particularly interesting. I don't have a clear understanding from reading the Act as to the intent by the government on the advisory boards, but I want to say that if their thoughts are some other level of governance, somewhere that the public could go to express concerns, that this is probably a good thing. The bill does state the function of an advisory board to provide advice to the council, and meaning municipal council, in relation to the enforcement of the law, the maintenance of the law, and the prevention of crime in the municipality, but the advisory board shall not exercise jurisdiction relating to complaints, discipline, personnel conduct, or internal management of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I guess, and I want to state that my interest in this is around the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, simply because that's the body that does the policing in a lot of rural municipalities, and certainly is the body that does the policing in the municipality of East Hants. So it's not necessarily clear in black and white what the role of the board is. I mean, I would say that if I wanted to complain about a police officer, I probably wouldn't go to this board. So if that's what this clause indicates, then there's probably some sense in that. I would go, certainly go to the staff sergeant, I guess, number one, but then onward to headquarters. Mr. Speaker, I think I, like all people, sometimes wonder about the ability of the departments, or the detachments, I guess, to carry out their job. I guess we're really pleased that we have a RCMP detachment in Enfield, have had for just a few years now, and because I think of our growing population in that area, basically bedroom community, and this would fall across the river into the HRM, the Fall River area and so on. I'm assuming those people would call that area as well. But I I have my reservations, I guess, around the federal government's approach to policing in light of federal cutbacks. And I know that, if I'm not mistaken, the Migratory Game Bird Act this was a section, of conservation officers actually that used to enforce the Migratory Game Bird Act, and that was turned over to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And the result of that, obviously, with cutbacks, et cetera, that if the detachment gets 2 calls, one is for an infraction regarding Migratory Game Bird Act, and the other one is break and enter. Which do you think that the detachment is going to respond to? So by and large, there really isn't an awful lot happening in terms of enforcement of these other areas. Actually, initially, it's my understanding that when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police took over enforcement of the Migratory Game Bird Act, they set up a particular patrol. I don't know if there's a better word than that, but certainly a group of officers designated to the enforcement of that act, and then with cutbacks, they got rolled into the regular force, and enforcement of that act kind of fell by the wayside. If somebody had time, or if it was, if there was kind of a slow day, then you might get reaction on the Migratory Game Bird Act, but you may not otherwise. So it's the ability of the federal government to look at enforcement as a priority, that communities as they grow should have a very visible and active force in those communities. I sometimes get complaints by people that they call and that get a long time between the call and the response. But I'll talk to a specific case which surprised me. I have to say, the good or bad of it, can be evaluated. But I guess the surprise that I got was, I went to my local detachment because it's right in the village of Enfield. So my office is just down the road. So there was an issue that I wanted to deal with the detachment on, and I went to the door, and of course it was locked. This was after 5 o'clock. And so I picked up, there's a phone right outside, right beside the door. So I picked up the phone, and actually the person who responded on the other end of the line was from Truro. So after 5 o'clock, or I think in my area, if you call the local detachment, you're going to get Truro. And then they're going to get in touch with somebody in the detachment, and they'll get back to you. And what happened in this case, I'm standing outside the door of the detachment. I tell this person my concern, and they say, "Oh, just hold on. There'll be somebody there in a second." So there were people, constables inside the detachment that I really couldn't get to except through this phone to somebody in Truro, and I'm standing in Enfield, right at the building. And I took that to be particularly odd. I can recognize all kinds of need for security, etc. And actually, Mr. Speaker, when you go enter the detachment, there is a kind of an entryway where you can speak through a small hole to somebody inside and tell them who you are and what you want, and then they'll either decide to let you in or not. So I recognize the need for security, and I would think that if that seems necessary through the day, then certainly I would think you should be able to enter the building at least to speak to somebody through the glass after hours. It's unclear, although I appreciate an effort by the government to allow for community input, but it's really unclear as to what the government sees as the real value in this group. But someone who can speak for the municipality on this board, I see that as a good thing, because I know that councillors will be receiving calls, or probably do on occasion, as I do, about what they think is inaction by the part of the RCMP, and justifiable or not, or how how much credibility you can give to complaints, but there will be someone, a body that they could take these issues of governance to, and hopefully get some resolve to their concern. But the one point I would like this body to be able to make is some way to, and maybe through this legislature, to send a message to the federal government that resources on enforcement, I think, are spread a little too thin, that communities echo this time and time again. And I think that as much as people appreciate the efforts of the Mana Police, I'd like to ensure, as with so many things that the governments are involved with, that they actually put the resources in place, not only to address the concerns of the citizens, but to also make sure that those officers who are doing the job have what they need to do the job appropriately. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to seeing this bill move forward, and hopefully get to speak to it another time. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Eastern Passage, Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on Bill number 131, an act respecting policing in Nova Scotia. I guess a bit of background first, if I may, just to give some understanding for the record of my my work with the police in the past, and then a bit about some of the provisions in the legislation. I guess I've looked at it from different levels, and I feel honored in many ways to have worked with the police in this province. And my work has come as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, predominantly. I originally had done work in Ontario as a prosecutor. When I came back here, my original work was with the old Halifax City Police before the regional municipality. Indeed, the member from Annapolis, his brother was, who's now the Deputy Chief of Police for the Halifax Regional Police Service, Chris McNeil, was a articling clerk at the time with the City of Halifax when I was working there as the prosecutor, and I got to know him quite well. He's one of those rare people who becomes a police officer and goes to law school and then goes back to policing. And I can say, though, this is a bit of an aside, that he is a great asset to the regional municipality and the police service in Halifax Regional Municipality, and he has a bright future in front of him as well. But in particular, my work at that time was mainly with regard to sort of summary offense proceedings in the city. But I got to know a lot of those police officers, and I had a lot of respect for the Halifax Police Force and the work that they did. At that time, in the early 1990s, they came through the 1980s. I believe there was a police strike at that time. There had been a lot of incidents around racial disharmony in the city, and that force, I think, in the early 90s, it can be said, began to really focus on its ability to be a very professional force. After that, I spent some time working in Dartmouth, predominantly with the RCMP. I'll make more comments about them in a minute, but also with the Dartmouth Police Force. And the Dartmouth Police Force as well had a lot of very good and capable officers who did a lot of extremely difficult work. And Mr. Speaker, they, in the end, through amalgamation, I think, and look, when you amalgamated the cities, it was a foregone conclusion that the police services would be amalgamated. As a result, we see the benefits that come from amalgamation, the economy of scale, the ability to provide more services. Instead of having 3 potential K-9 units, or 4 if you look at the detachments in the RCMP area, now maybe we only have 1. Again, I'll talk more about harmonization in a minute. But we at least see, I wanted to get on the record my, having worked with the Halifax Police Force, having worked with the Dartmouth Police Force as a prosecutor, and I very much respected the officers and the work they did. As a justice critic, and from the last 6.5 years as an MLA, probably, 4.5 of those years I spent as a justice critic, I've had an opportunity to meet with organizations throughout this province. The one that comes to mind most of all is Spring Hill. And it was only a few years ago that there was an incident out of Spring Hill, right around the time that they were discussing changes to the Police Act, Mr. Speaker. And I believe, I don't want to go too much detail because it's been a couple of years and I don't want to misspeak, but I do know that there was an incident around the Municipal Police Commission in that town, and the firing of the police chief. And it was a major concern in that community. In fact, I could say it divided that community. I remember going to a meeting in Spring Hill, in the high school, and seeing the division in the community and how difficult it can be. And my recollection was, it was specifically around the fact that the Municipal Police Commission was making decisions that many in the community thought were not the appropriate ones. Yet there was no ability to appeal those decisions, not even to the minister, let alone to the courts. Now, of course, you always have the right to challenge a decision of a tribunal through the courts, through certiorari, or through other means of challenging a decision, but they're fairly limited scope. And they're based on questions of law or questions of fact that are so patently unreasonable. I'm really getting into an area that's been a long time since I dealt with, so I'll move on. But the fact is that you do have certain rights to appeal, but nothing written down, nothing clearly, unless you're going to willing to hire a lawyer and spend a lot of money, that you can actually have an opportunity to take on. And Mr. Speaker, what we saw in Spring Hill was that there was a need to revise the Police Act. This came from the people of Spring Hill. They made that clear, and I know the member for Cumberland South, Mr. Speaker, is a man, as a police officer in that community, was very well aware of those issues. I've spoken to him about it in the past in conversation, and I know that those issues are still there, and I'm looking forward to this act, hopefully hearing at law amendments how people feel about it, because this is an opportunity to remedy some of those problems with the municipal police commissions, and whether or not we need to have them appealed, or whether we need to limit their mandate so that they're not directly involved in the hiring and firing or dealing with people on a regular basis on a day, and their role should be limited. We have a chief of police in every community. We have the head of detachments for the RCMP, and their job is to deal with the day-to-day operations of the police department. Unless we know that there is gross negligence occurring or serious problems being brought forward, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's the job of a municipal police commission to actually be intervening in those incidences. Their job is to develop policies as to how policing will take place in the community on a broader scale, on sort of a long-term vision, and that those things shouldn't be dealt with. They shouldn't be dealing with day-to-day operations. On the other hand, I still believe there's a role for a minister with regard to these municipal police commissions. Let's be frank. We are talking about in Nova Scotia. And I mean, Nova Scotia is a different policing regimen than you have in other provinces. In Ontario, you have the OPP, the member from Colchester North, having been a former member. I think it was up, I want to say Pickle I think that was correct. I remember him telling me, Mr. Speaker, that he was in Pickle Lake, and then they sent him to Brockville. And if anyone's been to Brockville's not a very big town, but it's probably maybe 50, 60,000. I remember him saying to me that it was too big, and he was glad to go back to Pickle Lake because he liked the quiet of Pickle Lake. But and I haven't been to Pickle Lake. I can only tell you I've been as far as Thunder Bay and Kenora and Dryden, but I never made it far north up to Pickle Lake. But you know, that works well in Ontario. Predominantly because the OPP plays a role as the provincial police force. Now, this act does mention the Nova Scotia Provincial Police, which is a term to many in this province, and particularly in Cape Breton, when you think about Davis Day, and you think about the old Nova Scotia Provincial Police and what they were brought in to do in Cape Breton in the 1920s to bust up unions and bust up strikes. It's a term to many people in this province, particularly in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. The phrase Nova Scotia Provincial Police has a very negative connotation and one with a history. It's interesting to see it in the Act as a term, but it also says that basically what we're talking about is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police will be our provincial police. And again, I'll talk a little later about the Mounties, but Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I think we have an incredible force in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But I digress from my original point, which is in Ontario we have the OPP, and in many of the smaller towns or townships, the OPP takes on the job of being the police. In some of the larger cities, they may have a municipal force. I'm not sure where the line is drawn. I know that in Toronto, obviously, they have their own police force, or in Hamilton, you may have one for an entire township. But in most of those townships, Mr. Speaker, we're talking 100,000 people, even if you're talking in the north, the township of Algoma, or the township, or Timmins area, right? You're talking, a large population base. So you have an OPP force, or maybe they have their own force. Well, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, we happen to have very small police forces in small towns. And by small, let's be clear, I represent Coal Harbour Eastern Passage. Coal Harbour has a population approaching 30,000 people. Eastern Passage has a population approaching 12,000 people. And most of the municipal police forces in this province are for towns much smaller than that. I look at Yarmouth potentially as a town that has 8,000 people, or Spring Hill, I'm only speculating, but it's probably around 5,000 people. Kentville, maybe 10. You have police forces for very small communities. And you have to ensure in those circumstances, given the nature of policing, given the power And this is about the rule of law, Mr. Speaker. This is about ensuring that our police officers understand that they have incredible power, but power that they're not going to use on a regular basis. And Mr. Speaker, you come from the Pictou area. They have, I still believe, 3 or 4 police forces there. I'm assuming Stellarton, Trenton, and New Glasgow anyway. I don't think Pictou has its own, the town. I think they use the RCMP. Westville. So these are very small communities. Westville and the others are not very big. And you have to ensure this is a system that can work, and it has worked well in Nova Scotia. But it has worked well, Mr. Speaker, because we have the ability in the Police Act to ensure the police officers understand their role, that they have to have the proper training, and they have in this province. The police officers have been given the training, I think, to do their job very well. The municipal, RCMP, city police forces. But on top of it, we need to know that there are checks and balances, and that's where the Police Act comes in. We have to know that when you talk about the powers of a police officer under the Criminal Code or under bylaw enforcement or under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, because this Act gives them the power to enforce every statute in this province, Mr. Speaker. They're a peace officer. They have awesome powers, Mr. Speaker. We have to ensure that there's checks and balances to ensure, particularly in smaller towns where you have smaller police forces and, quite frankly, where everyone knows everyone else. You have to ensure that there are checks and balances to ensure that that system does not break down, that the rule of law is properly enforced, that the police officers understand the need to use kid gloves, so to speak, when they're dealing with the powers they have. Or you just can't, in that circumstance, if a police officer in a small town of 2,000 or 3,000 people felt that they had the powers, and they do, and they weren't properly trained, or God forbid that some of them may feel that those powers need to be used, you could have very serious circumstances involving the breach of the rule of law potentially. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that the Police Act be in place to provide those checks and balances. We have these municipal police commissions, that's great. But Mr. Speaker, these municipal police commissions need to ensure that we also have the ability to question, again, in a small town with a small town council, with a small police force, it's very easy for us to see a problem occur, and it's important that there be checks and balances, and that's what the Police Act does. And the minister needs to have that power. The minister is accountable to this House. The government is accountable to this House, and that will ensure that we have that. I'm not sure that's in here yet. My scan of this Act does not in any way provide me with a clear sense that there's an appeal process, and I don't know if there's anyone from the staff here, but I'd like to have some understanding that there is actually an appeal from a municipal commission, a police commission, if for some reason there was a questionable decision being made. The minister should be able to intervene. It does talk about the minister having certain powers, but I'd like to spell it a little more clear so people understand that when a municipal police commission gets involved in a matter, if their decision is not based on good law, is not based on the facts, is based on politics, and God forbid that happens, we need to know that there are checks and balances to protect the people in that community, Mr. Speaker. Now, having said that, I do want to talk about the ministerial powers in this Act, not getting into details because that's for later debate. But, Mr. Speaker, for example, there's a section in this Act that allows the minister to exempt parts of this province from the provisions of the Act. He actually can, by regulation, through Cabinet, make pass a regulation that says, HRM, this Act does not apply. Pictou County, this Act does not apply. I don't think it's been used. I have no idea. I'm beginning to look, the first thought I had, not to make this too much of a scare factor, because I think there's probably a legitimate reason for the clause in here, but it begins to think about the fact that you're basically taking away people's rights to complain under the Act, take away the ability of the police officers to be have to meet certain standards, whether it's training standards or whether it's standards of what they're able to do. I'm not sure why the minister needs a power to exempt, and it basically says a part of the province. And it says not all of it, so presumably he could, exempt 99.9% as long as 0.1% was allowed to be covered by the Act. I'm not clear why that is. And I may be, through this, if anyone from the department is listening, or the Minister of Justice, there's an opportunity to explain that. But there is the ability to exempt certain parts of the province by regulation. That's a pretty awesome power in itself. And I talked about police departments, particularly municipal ones, needing checks and balances. I would argue the minister needs checks and balances as well. Of course he has to go to Cabinet. Of course he has to do that. I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that, if the minister wants to exempt certain parts of this province from the Police Act, maybe there needs to be an act of the legislature to do that. If there's an emergency situation that requires action, I'm not sure why we need to take away the Police Act. There are other ways of doing that. There are ways of doing that that I would suggest can be operated upon that don't involve exempting the ability of people to complain or the people to use the powers in the Police Act to ensure their police forces are being properly monitored and are doing the right thing in their communities, Mr. Speaker. He also has the power to audit and review police departments. I'm not sure how often that happens, Mr. Speaker. I would like to think that it's happening regularly. Again, I hope the department can shed some light on that. It says he may. I understand in legal drafting terms why we use the term may as compared to shall, but I would hope that this is something that's going on. Again, checks and balances involve not only waiting for a problem, but being proactive, and I would hope the Minister and the Department of Justice and the Police Services Division are and will continue to be actively auditing and reviewing police forces to ensure that things are working properly. And maybe if that clause was in there, the incident in Spring Hill may not have erupted. Maybe there was a way in which they could have issued an audit. Maybe it was just a decision of the Minister of Justice not to intervene. I don't know. But those incidences are not uncommon, and they need potentially to ensure that there are those checks and balances, and that includes an audit and review. There's an ability to have a complaints commissioner in this act. I think that's a good thing. I'm not sure if it's new. I think it is, but I'm not absolutely sure. There's a police review board, which obviously we've had in the past. I'm trying to think about the gentleman who died in the cells in Sydney, and they ended up having a review of his case. Bailey, I believe it was. And that was an inquiry that went on in Sydney back in 2003, I believe. And it was under this act. It would have been under 2002. Yeah, was it still? It's the former Minister of Justice is just helping me. I don't think I've heard a final decision on that one. But these are boards that occur from time to time when there's a serious concern about how a police department worked. You know, that's counterbalanced. Again, checks and balances. There's a way of looking at this. That's counterbalanced with, I spoke today with someone from a police officer, and I said, what do you think of this act? He said, I haven't had a chance to look at it in great detail, but he said, my concern is that there are people out there that, on the other side, are promoting frivolous complaints because they've been charged legitimately. The police decide to charge someone, and they decide to file a complaint under the Police Act in hopes of bargaining it down. Well, we don't need that. The police officers are doing their job, and they're recognizing that there might be a criminal or a quasi-criminal offense. If they decide to lay a charge, they need to know that there won't be complaints, permanent marks on their record as a police officer because they're doing their job. Yes, we need to ensure that there is, where there has been egregious or serious violations of the Police Act or of the rights of a citizen, that there is an ability to complain. But maybe we need to look, and I'll draw on the Barristers Act, and I believe some of the other acts use this as well, Mr. Speaker. They have an internal disciplinary process to determine whether basically, does it meet the smell test? Is there enough evidence for it to go to a disciplinary hearing? And they eliminate a lot of the frivolous complaints that way before it even becomes public, so you don't have the public sort of dragging a police officer's name through the mud. Maybe we need that process here. Maybe there needs to be an ability to have a police officer's case, a complaint reviewed to determine whether it meets a certain level of seriousness, whether it's frivolous, whether it's vexatious. If it is frivolous or vexatious, we will not take it any further. I'm not sure that's in here. Again, if the department can clarify some of these things, I was briefed, I will say for the record beforehand, these sort of detailed issues weren't brought up. I'll be glad to have more information. But again, I'd hate to see where there is frivolous or vexatious complaints because an officer is doing his or her job, that this act not be used as a stick to try and plea bargain. That's not the right thing to do. On the other hand, it's good to see in this act provisions to ensure that where there is potentially a serious violation, and I would say police officers where there's a serious allegation want their name cleared as well. And in the case of this case in Sydney or in other cases that have come up in the past, I'm sure that has been part of the process, and it's an important part of the process. I want to talk about the RCMP because my area, which I represent, is what they still call the former county of Halifax. It is under RCMP mandate. And it has changed. I was noting the member from Hansee's comments about having to call the detachment and get someone in Truro. I was talking to someone the other day who told me that they called their detachment in Sackville, or was it Tantallon? I can't remember which one in the HRM, and they actually spoke to someone in Toronto. And that doesn't necessarily give people a lot of confidence that there's someone on the other end of the line who's going to be able to quickly come and deal with a matter. Now, it's not 911, let's be clear. We all know if there's a 911 call, it's gone to a central dispatch if it's an emergency. But there are situations in which you want to talk to someone, and I've had this happen to me. And instead of calling, and it's changed. I've talked to the Vern Fraser, who's the head of RCMP in the metro area. and it's been on my list of things to do to talk to him in more detail. But so people understand, at least in the HRM, which is my experience. Let me start by going back a bit first. I have the utmost respect for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and I want to tell a little anecdote about being in Kosovo a couple of years ago and meeting with some of the people who worked for the organization I was working with, and they were translators right after the war. And the first people who came in to do investigations of mass murder, of mass graves, who did investigations of allegations of atrocities, a lot of those were RCMP. And I'll tell you, the reputation of that force in Eastern Europe is second to none, Mr. Speaker, because for a lot of different reasons, for historic, for cultural, because we have a national police force, Mr. Speaker, it is probably the most respected police force in the world, because it's a police force for the whole country, and a very large country at that. And that has resulted in us having a police force that around the world, when you say the Mounties or you show a picture of a Mountie, everyone knows it's connected to Canada. They recognize it as a symbol of Canada, but also the pride in Canada. In both, it says so much about the RCMP. It's about a police officer. It's about, recognition of the rule of law, about democracy in Canada. I can assure you that when people talk about, police departments in Russia, they're probably not necessarily looking at them with the same fondness as they are of the Mounties, because they know that the Mounties are a respected police force, a police force that actually does its job but doesn't overstep its bounds, and is actually doing it in a way that both protects the citizens from criminals, but at the same time ensures that the rights of citizens are being protected. That's not an easy line to walk. That's not an easy line to walk, and I can say that in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have a force that's second to none in the world, Mr. Speaker, and they're very well trained, and we should be proud of the fact that we have them. Now, the member from Hants East, I will correct him on a small point, because he did say the federal government needs to do more to ensure they're funded. Let's be clear. The RCMP in this province are funded by the provincial government. And, Mr. Speaker, that means that the federal government makes an arrangement, signs a contract with the provincial government, but it's the province that decides how much money is going to be spent and how many officers we're going to have in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, it's the province, it's the Department of Justice that makes those decisions. And it's the Department of Justice from those decisions that decides what we need. Now, in my own area, how's this resulted? Well, it's resulted in, first of all, I believe we're one of the only jurisdictions left in Canada, now that Cape Breton regional municipalities moved to one police force, that still has two separate police forces in, again, the old city of Dartmouth and the old city of Halifax. I hate using these terms, but they still are relevant. You have and the town of Bedford, former town of Bedford. You have the Halifax Regional Police Service, an amalgamation of the former police forces. In Sackville, in Cole Harbour, in Ecumsecum, in Eastern Passage, in Tantallon, in Herring Cove, in Hubbards, in Upper Sackville, you have, Mr. Speaker, you have the RCMP, based in 4 detachments, 5, I guess. Sheet Harbour, Musquodoboit Harbour, Sackville, Cole Harbour, and Tantallon. They cover very large areas. And for a long time, we were very impressed with the number of police officers we had. I know for years as an MLA, when I had to call, I had a staff sergeant as the head of the detachment in Cole Harbour, and he had the complete right to make decisions with regard to his force in that detachment. And as a result, and he had like 50 people in the Cole Harbour detachment, but that covers probably close to, 60, 70,000 people. The Sackville detachment I know is much larger, and then the Tantallon detachment is probably a good size as well. The ones in Musquodoboit Harbour and Sheet Harbour are somewhat smaller. But in those detachments you had police forces, you had standalone in many ways. The detachment had the ability with the staff sergeant to make decisions about policing, about staffing, about where they would go. We had community liaison officers for every community. Eastern Passage had its own, Preston had its own, the Prestons, I should say. Lake Echo did, Porters Lake did, they all had their own. What's happened? Well, at some point, someone decided it was important that we harmonize. And like everything else, when we talk about harmonizing, it always sounds good until you see how it works in practice. And what happened was, I was told a year and a half ago they were going to harmonize. Because in our community of almost 12,000, we didn't have regular police patrols. And we said, look, we want a police officer here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 12,000 people. I mean, is that asking too much to have one officer on patrol all the time? I know the communities of Lake Echo or Porter's Lake also are important, but they're not a quarter the size of Eastern Passage, and Eastern Passage was being treated equally to them. And I said, that's wrong, and we pushed for the RCMP to bring in 24/7 policing in our community. Well, I will give them credit. We have that now. Now, part of harmonization meant, though, that all those general investigative services, GIS police officers that were in Cole Harbour doing things there, or maybe they were moved around to the other detachments, were taken out, staff sergeant removed. Now if I have a problem, a concern, a question in the Cole Harbour detachment, I don't go to, there is someone in Cole Harbour, he's a corporal now, but the watch commander is one watch commander for all 5 detachments in HRM. And that's a much bigger area, much harder to get in touch with that person and much more difficult to touch base with. I also have concerns about the fact that I've made phone calls and I've had trouble getting through. I've talked to this about with Vern Fraser, and I've said to him, look, there are wrinkles to be worked out. I said, I'm willing to hold my breath and make sure that this system is working. But the fact is that I'd hate to see harmonization as an excuse for downsizing. And if that's what's happening, then I have some serious concerns. The jury is still out on that one in my mind, Mr. Speaker. I haven't come to a conclusion as to whether or not harmonization has worked or hasn't worked. I do know we do have more regular policing in our community. That's a good thing. We have regular patrols 24/7. That's a good thing. At the same time, the community police officers that we had is gone. We have 1 community police officer for the old Cole Harbour detachment instead of the 4 or 5 that we had. There's questions about whether the DARE program may have to be readjusted. All these things, Mr. Speaker, are issues that need to be looked at. But I will go back to the point that the RCMP is the best police force in the world, and we need to keep them and the services they provide and the training and the expertise that they have. But at the same time, the contracts that are negotiated with the RCMP must reflect the fact that people need to have some assurance. My understanding is statistically, the rate of crime in Canada and in Nova Scotia is going down. The rate of violent crime in Nova Scotia has not been this low since before I was born, Mr. Speaker. Now that says something about violence in our society. On the other hand, as people like to note, the reporting of violent crime is probably quadrupled or increased tenfold. So we keep hearing about violent crime, and we keep thinking we're less safe than we were before, but in fact, if you look at the numbers, we're actually safer than we were back then, going back to the mid-1960s. And yet, I think it's like anything in the legal system, perception is reality, and it's important for the provincial government to know that people feel that they have security. And security sometimes is just watching that police cruiser drive by your house once a day. It's understanding that there is someone who is actually going to be out there patrolling the streets. And Mr. Speaker, that's not always a concern that is being addressed, and it's one that I'd hate to see this government, or if it's the municipal government, negotiating contracts with the RCMP that are resulting in fewer and fewer services in the outskirts of the city, which is really, the suburbs and into the ex-urban area, Mr. Speaker. That's really what's happening. And these places also have issues. In fact, I would argue the issues are great because it becomes a perfect storm of youth criminal activity, Mr. Speaker, because you don't have the facilities. My community hasn't had a new recreational facility in 8 years, and there's lots of reasons for that I'm hoping will change with the new municipal election. But we at least have, no new recreational facilities. Our community's doubled in size, tripled in size, really, in the past 15 years. And with no new recreational facilities, with all kinds of young kids, now that we have these subdivisions being built that have basically one tot lot for 1,000 houses, these kids have nothing to do. I got a call yesterday from a woman saying she was, upset because the kids are hanging out in the tot lot drinking beer and breaking beer bottles. It's a one tot lot for 1,000 houses in this one subdivision. But, I said, well, we'll talk to the police, try and get them to do patrols. But there's nothing for the kids to do. And our community's trying to rally to try and do something. But the fact is, in the more suburban areas where you have rapid growth, that's where you have the problems, because there aren't the positive alternatives for the youth, because there isn't facilities, they get bored, they end up getting into activities they shouldn't, and that's where you need the police. And not only reactively, 24/7 patrols, but also, Mr. Speaker, you need the police there to do proactive work in the community, whether it's the DARE program, which I support so fully, whether it is, just actively being in the community, encouraging a positive image of the police, things that are very, very important. But, Mr. Speaker, if we take community-based policing, if we take that out of the suburbs, which I represent, Mr. Speaker, and which other members of this House represent, we're putting ourselves in a position where we're not going to have enough police on the ground. They're not going to not only be proactive, yet reactive, and it's going to cause problems. And I'd hate to see us shortchanging our police services, not negotiating deals, trying to cut back nickel and dime our police services in the suburbs or anywhere else, and as a result, we end up having problems with how can we provide policing and protection. And it is petty crime in many cases. The amount of murders occurring in the suburbs or in Nova Scotia are going down, but Mr. Speaker, at the same time, it's that petty crime that makes people feel safe. You know, whether you're a senior, whether you're an adult, whether you're another child, at school being bullied, you don't want to leave your house if you feel unsafe. And unsafe can mean next to you is a tot lot where the kids are breaking beer bottles at 11 o'clock at night. These are the things that need to be addressed. I'm glad to see this advisory councils are going to be created for the RCMP. I hope that there's an opportunity. My understanding is there'll only be one for HRM, though. I mean, and I brought this up at the briefing because I said, that's great if you're in Digby County, because Digby's a small-ish county, and because it's relatively small, one advisory council may do. But for HRM, as far as I can tell in this act, there will be one advisory council for, a couple of 100,000 people covered by the RCMP. Well, some of the Halifax is covered by the Halifax Regional Police Service, but the ones covered by RCMP will have one advisory council. I'd almost like to see some changes that would allow for maybe in the Halifax area, one per detachment, or something that would allow us to say, look, if we're going to have an advisory council, why don't we have one for the eastern side of HRM, from the old city of Dartmouth, here we are again, the old city of Dartmouth boundary down to Sheet Harbour. Why don't we have one for the northern parts, Sackville, Oakfield, Wellington, Upper Sackville, Hammonds Plains? Why don't we have one for the western side, from Bay Road, Tantallon, all the way down to Hubbard's, so that way at least there'll be some sense that this advisory council can tap into the issues in those communities. We're talking, tens of thousands of people in those communities, and instead of having one detachment for all of HRM, why don't we have 2 or 3 or 4 detachments so there's an opportunity for the people in those communities to feel more in touch with their detachment, because that's who they deal with, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's important that that be the case. So, as I said, we'll be supporting this bill at second reading. I do want to hear at-law amendments from some people. I'm hoping that people will come forward. It's an opportunity for them, because I'd hate to see people not take the opportunity and then find out in a year or two they have concerns with how this is drafted. We can only look at this and determine based on wording what it says, but until you get on-the-ground practical experience with the implementation of a new police act, it's always challenging. And I would hope that if people have some sense of concerns, this is their opportunity to do it. I've noted a couple. As I said, there's no appeal process from the municipal police commissions as I can see it right now, and I'd like to see something for that. I'd like to see more RCMP advisory councils in the HRM area, more than one, a guarantee of more than one. I would like to see more checks and balances on police departments. And also, I'm not clear why the minister needs a power to exempt parts of this province from the Police Act, and maybe if that can be explained, these are things that can be dealt at law amendments, or by third reading, hopefully I'll have answers that I can respond to. So that's my time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for listening.
Yes, recognize the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
That's it. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I really do welcome the arrival of this act and the chance to speak to it as well. I should say at first that this is an issue that has been of great concern in my area for many of the reasons that my colleague has mentioned, and those are the expansion of a significant urban area and the inclusion of formerly rural areas, something of a disconnect between the RCMP and the Halifax Police Department, and varying, I won't say qualities of policing by any stretch of the imagination, but varying standards by which these are administered. I think that this is a welcome first step, and hopefully more than a first step, toward the harmonization of services, both in my constituency and throughout the province. To the degree that it establishes Nova Scotia Provincial Police and a police commission, that it establishes the ability in the minister to set standards and define the powers of those bodies, I think it is a very welcome step. But I am concerned, as is my colleague, about the minister's ability to exempt areas from the application of the Act. The degree to which it's possible for the minister to move officers around the province, as long as he reimburses the affected municipalities for that, is a very significant step towards ensuring that there is a single controlling hand in at least the distribution of police acts, but we must be very careful to ensure that this is used with the degree of respect and caution required in such a large power. I think the main thing that we look at is that overarching responsibility the minister has to ensure adequate and effective level of policing. And although that does vary across the province, I think that this one thing which I have become aware of in Halifax Atlantic is the fact that the policing of densities of population is not necessarily the same. In my area, Halifax Atlantic, as I've said, the Halifax Police Department, with its 403 officers, is responsible through the West Division for the policing of this. And the police to population ratio is approximately 1 to 600. In other areas, however, oh, okay, thank you. Okay. Other areas, however, other parts of my constituency, which are policed by the RCMP with its 162 to 167 officers out of the 10, and those, most particularly those coming out of the Tantallon detachment, serve an average of 900 police per individual officer. That's quite a discrepancy. And it is true, as I have pointed out in the past, that the distances that have to be traveled in those formerly rural areas, now encompassed by the Halifax Regional Municipality, are much, much greater. And certainly we have welcomed the recent opening of a community office, or the recent announcement of an opening of a community office for the RCMP, which will be on the branch of the sort of eastern branch of the RCMP's Tantallon detachment. There's still always a lot of distance to be covered, and it is an important function of the minister's responsibility, as I've said, to ensure that there is an adequate and effective level of policing provided throughout the province. One thing which I would very much like to see included, probably in the Municipal Government Act, but it should be encompassed here as well, is an assurance that there will in fact be a similar level of coverage, that population density is a factor in determining policing. It's not to say that any one area of a city or of the province is more crime-prone than any other, but any rapidly growing area without a concomitant increase in police coverage is going to be more open to not necessarily major crime, but the casual crime that accompanies any dense population area. And I can say from personal experience and from relaying to you the experience of numerous constituents in Halifax Atlantic, increasing population density does mean the increasing incidence of minor crime and major crime as well, although luckily we don't have to worry about that quite as much or as often. So I would very much like to see this included explicitly as a factor in development decisions, that policing is one of those services which needs to be supported in any new development areas. It's true that each division of the Halifax Police Department has a sort of an adopted neighbourhood program, and the RCMP also has the adopted neighbourhood program and the village constable things, and that the RCMP has community offices. Both, however, have suffered from the real need for citizen support as well. There's staffing as well. There's administrative staff required as well. And in some cases, in the case of the RCMP certainly, community offices have been staffed by volunteers, which seems a terrible burden to place on such a, such a dignified and respected institution to rely on volunteer staffing to the degree that eventually those offices do close. This is a place where the Minister of Justice can step in to ensure that where there are offices are staffed. It's wonderful to have police officers. It's even more wonderful to have the efforts of police officers coordinated. In this vein, I think it's rather interesting to look at the sort of different community values that are brought to policing by the different forces. In meeting with the RCMP and with the Halifax Police Department, both of them have told me about the results of town hall meetings. And I think it's fascinating to see the different kinds of focuses that are brought. Town hall meetings conducted by the RCMP identified 4 areas of concern. They were, in order of priority, youth, so-called, visibility, traffic, and ATVs. When the Halifax Police Department held its town hall meetings and identified 4 areas of concern, they were safe communities, healthy, vibrant communities, excellence in service, and excellence in governance. I find it very, very difficult indeed to reconcile these two systems, these two sets of values. And yet, in the policing area, it is essential that we do, in fact, reconcile these values, because it is always the same population which is in need of police services. Here, the minister has an important role to play. I'd like to say, too, to take the opportunity to say that quality of life issues in the urban areas particularly, or in the sort of ex-urban areas, are increasingly important. And with that, look at the so-called youth issues, the parks policing, and the use of ATVs, and as it's put, convincing noisemakers to stay away from other people. These quality of life issues are really the bread and butter issues of the police, but they are the things that make it possible or impossible to live in a given community. I have had constituents, and numerous constituents, who are really falling into the cracks between, into the seams perhaps, which are being knitted together, but only gradually, between the two forces. And those constituents are ready to leave their homes because of shortfalls, inability to actually join to knit the two together, policing shortfalls. And I will say that often those issues do center around, I won't say all-terrain vehicles, but the use of all-terrain vehicles. And I have to say that there are a number of constituents who have come to me, and they are genuinely frightened by the use in what are essentially suburban areas. They have been rural areas, but they are becoming suburban areas. And it's not the use of all-terrain vehicles, but the fact that they facilitate sometimes some of those activities which the police would prosecute if they could, but the police are not always able to get at it. So as well as the actual provision of police services, we need to look at the vehicles with which police provide those services. And perhaps with that, I should say, this might be a place to bring up one of my own real favorite subjects, which is the vehicles that the police use are an important part of the perception.
Would the honourable member entertain a question? The honourable member for Cape Breton West, do you have a question?
Yes. Answer. Is it yes? Well, Mr. Speaker, just seeking some clarification. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic has indicated in reference to the RCMP priorities, and one of them was regards to youth. And then she went on further to say youth, so-called. Could she define what that particular term is in reference to?
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic, you have the floor.
Okay, well, I know how I define youth, but I'm not completely sure how the population, talking to the RCMP meetings, were defining youth. But what I did gather was that youth was a form of expressing what in many ways were, in fact, those so-called quality of life issues as well. I mean, when it was gathered under the label of youth, and this is probably not fair at all, people were, in fact, talking about vandalism concerns and park patrols and so on. But, you know, there's no guarantee by any stretch of the imagination that we're referring to people tightly defined as youth. So, sorry? Well, you know. Ignore him. Okay. Yeah, that's a good. Yeah. All right. Okay. What I was going to say, and this goes to quality of life issues as well, and it does go to the fact that many people identify youth as a source of their policing problems, is that it's very important that, and this act does address this, that policing be integrated in a positive way as well into the life of the community. I can't tell you how many times people say, I wish we had the foot patrol. The bicycles are certainly a somewhat welcome addition, but I should throw into the mix the fact that there's nothing more beloved, there's nothing to attract the attention of young people more than the appearance of the mounted policeman. We used to have the stables here, and there's now one symbolic horse, I think his name is Justice, who's ridden around the streets periodically. But it's very interesting to see how many children and adults come up to engage with the officer who's on horseback there. And I know that the city of Boston has very, very successfully brought back its horse patrols. Not because horseback patrol is necessarily the most effective means of policing, but because it is a very effective means of engaging the community with their policemen in a positive way. And when my colleague is talking about a proactive approach to policing, I think that's the sort of imagination that can be brought to bringing policing into the community as not a crisis issue. I hope, too, that this is going to address, there are some very imaginative issues, some very imaginative initiatives which have been brought into play by the RCMP with their City Watch programs and so on, and those are very proactive ways of engaging the community as well by offering the use of their communication systems for community public announcements and so on. Going back to the issue of development density, I think that, well, I hope that the minister will ensure that, in fact, that adequate and effective level of policing does include the requirement to add the pay for, if it's more RCMP officers, then it's more RCMP officers. If it's more Halifax police officers, it's more Halifax police officers. Where the density is, the municipalities need to provide, or the municipalities and the province in cooperation need to ensure the services are provided. Another tool which the RCMP has used in the past, and the province may want to look at it where they are talking about policing outside the urban core, is residential policing. It's usually happened in northern communities, and but it could certainly be happening just as well in some of the outlying areas of the province. It's where an RCMP officer is actually set to live in a given community. That's another one of those proactive ways in which the police can be integrated with the community. Looking too at the different scales of pay that are possible, it seems hardly fair that depending on the arrangement between the province and the municipality, RCMP officers may be paid at an extremely different rate of pay. And I would hope that this act will provide for greater consistency in this as well. With that, I think, Mr. Speaker, I would like to wrap up, but I look forward very much to the comments that will come to the Law Amendments Committee on this, because this is an important act, and it has and will have intimate ramifications for people throughout the province. So with that, I'll close, Mr. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to speak very briefly on this bill. We all speak about the Police Act coming from our particular perspective, and there is a perspective that I wanted to remark on that we haven't heard from earlier today, and that is my particular experience has been as a lawyer appearing before the Police Commission that is, or the Police Review Board, the body that hears complaints about police officers. And it so happens that I've appeared before the Police Review Board over the years, both on behalf of a police officer who's being complained against and also on behalf of a complainant. And then in my capacity as MLA, I occasionally will get a call from a constituent who is complaining about police conduct. And the point is this, is that our police system stands and falls on people's belief that if they think the police have been remiss in the way they carried out their duties, there must be an independent review body to investigate and assess the conduct of the police. And the difficulty that we have is very simply that the general public does not trust the Police Commission and the Police Review Board to be impartial. Now, I personally believe that that is ill-founded. My personal experience with the Police Commission and the Police Review Board is that they are thoroughly professional and that citizens should trust in their processes. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that many people don't. Because in all the consultation that the government has done on this bill, that's a group that never gets asked what they think. The people that get consulted are the police forces, the full-time civil servants who are engaged in the Police Commission work and the Police Review Board. The people who don't get asked what they think, unless I'm very much mistaken, is lawyers who are appearing before these bodies and the people they represent, the people who have from time to time occasion to complain about the police. Of course, the other group that's not consulted, I have to say, are members of this legislature. So the government brings this complex act before the legislature, which completely revamps the way the police are governed in Nova Scotia. And they say, among other things, well, this has been the subject of years of consultation. Well, if it's been the subject of years of consultation, one would think that maybe in minority government we would get a bit more of a heads up about what's in it. Because when we're told what to expect, it's often on the morning that it's introduced. Or under minority government, the big revamp is that we get told sometimes the day before, sometimes. How is it that we're supposed to assess the merits or demerits of such a complex piece of legislation when it's put on the table and then a few days later we're expected to stand up and debate it, especially if it's been the subject of years of consultation? So the problem, as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, is that our citizens don't have confidence in the Police Commission. My first involvement as an MLA was when one of my constituents called and she had a very long, complex, convoluted story about what the police had done to her and her family. And I tried to convince her that it was not my job as the MLA to investigate the police. I don't have the resources to look into these situations to decide who was right or wrong or what happened or didn't happen. But I also see it as my responsibility to let people know what the processes are that are there to help them and protect them. So I tried to steer her towards the Police Commission, but of course she had absolutely no faith in the Police Commission whatsoever. She'd had some prior dealing with them and it hadn't gone her way, and so she didn't want to deal with them at all. And it's a very difficult situation to be in. Now, why do I think this is important in the context of this bill, Mr. Speaker? Well, it's because the Police Commission is essentially being abolished. Or to use the words of the minister, the government house leader who was speaking on behalf of the Minister of Justice, what they're doing is they're amalgamating the two heretofore separate bodies, the Police Commission and the Police Review Board, which in the existing system carry out two completely different functions. One is the preliminary investigation and early decision making, but if a full inquiry, full public hearing is required, it is the Police Review Board that does it. And now those two bodies, which are quite properly entirely separate, are now being put together. Why, Mr. Speaker? Is it because it's going to produce better outcomes for the people of Nova Scotia? Is it because it's going to produce more faith, or Nova Scotians can have more faith in this investigative body? No, Mr. Speaker. The words used by the minister are, it will be more efficient. Well, that, of course, is government code for it's going to save money. Well, there's nothing wrong with saving money, Mr. Speaker, as long as you don't let that trump all the other considerations. Sometimes having an independent and effective police complaints body is worth the money. So if the government is pushing this particular change through because it saves money, well, let's hear how much. How much, and how can we be assured that the investigation process will continue to be as effective as it is today? Because, Mr. Speaker, we've got a problem. I believe the process is effective because I've had some personal dealings with it, both as a lawyer and as an MLA. In my role as advocate as an MLA, I've had some dealings with it and have been quite satisfied with the outcomes. But there are many people, particularly those on the margins of society, who do not have any faith at all. And what do they see in this bill? Are their protections being increased? Is this review body going to be more effective? Is it going to protect them better? Is it going to be able to get more quickly to the bottom of their complaints? No, Mr. Speaker, what we hear is, in essence, that it's being done to save money. So I see that as a problem. I see that as a problem, a theme that runs through a number of pieces of government legislation where they say they're doing it for one purpose, but the real reason is because it saves some amount of money. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I register my concern. Certainly I agree with our justice critic that this bill, comprehensive as it is, deserves to go through second reading, but that doesn't mean that every part of it isn't deserving of much closer scrutiny. And I would suggest to this House, Mr. Speaker, that in particular, the complaints process, the new complaints process, deserves much more careful scrutiny before it's approved by this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question has been called. All those in favor of moving the bill signify by saying aye. Aye. Contrary minded?
Bill 131.
Carried.
Entitled An Act Respecting Policing in Nova Scotia. Refer to law amendment.
Order this bill be sent to law amendments. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think we'll carry on with public bills for second reading. Mr. Speaker, I'd move that Bill 135 be considered to be on the order paper for second reading.
Is it agreed? Agreed. It's agreed. Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move Bill 135 for second reading.
The motion is for second reading. Question's been called. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Contrary minded? Carried.
Carried. Bill 135, entitled An Act to amend Chapter 1, 1992 Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
I order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 129, the Pension Benefits Act, for second reading, and I so move, Mr. Speaker.
Bill number 129, Pension Benefits Act. Recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I left off the previous day speaking about the Pension Benefits Act, and this particular provision, I just wanted to recap and remind members where I was at when I left off the other day. This particular bill, of course, eliminates the so-called grow-in benefit for all pensioners in all pension plans anywhere in Nova Scotia, provided, of course, that it meets the conditions for the grow-in benefit to apply. I had also reminded the House that this very provision had been before the House previously, namely in the spring, in the Financial Measures 2004 Act. And I had reminded members that one of the things that we had complained about at the time was the fact that the government was loading up the Financial Measures Act with things that simply didn't belong there. They had absolutely nothing to do with the provincial budget, did not have any impact on provincial finances, and yet they were in the Financial Measures Act in an apparent attempt to force this House to approve them because defeating the Financial Measures Act or any part of it is arguably a confidence motion.
Order. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Friday past, when I was doing my dissertation on this particular piece of legislation, the member for Halifax Fairview challenge the validity of some of the observations I was making in terms of the support for this particular piece of legislation. And during the course of my presentation, I suggested that the labor component of HRM fully supported this particular piece of legislation, and the honourable member for Halifax Fairview challenged that assertion and demanded to have the documents tabled that would support that. And Mr. Speaker, I feel only appropriate to table these particular documents from the various labor components of HRM. From the Halifax Regional Police Association, I will table that document. I will also table the document from the Nova Scotia Union of Public Employees supporting that particular piece of legislation. From the non-union Municipal Employees Association, also supporting the legislation, and also CUPE Local 108, that's the Canadian Union of Public Employees, with regards to this particular piece of legislation, again, and dated as late as October 4th, 2004. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's imperative that all members of the legislature have that information and not to be misled by the assertion that no such validation was
The honourable
forthcoming.
member makes several points, but it's not a point of order. I'll recognize the member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Liberals complain about when a government minister does that, and then later the same day they stand up and do the same thing, raising a non-existent point of order, addressing something that I never said. Okay, but that's the Liberal way. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I had reminded members the other day that the Liberals have flip-flopped on this issue since the spring. Okay, it was before us in the spring, and it was withdrawn with the support of the Liberals, Mr. Speaker. And I had reminded member that it's just the latest in a series of Liberal flip-flops, because for example, on Sunday shopping, well, they're foursquare against Sunday shopping, and apparently their new leader, the person who's going to be their new leader, is against Sunday shopping, and they're all for it. What's their position going to be now? Okay, and they're against VLTs, Mr. Speaker, very strongly against VLTs, and the guy who's going to be their new leader is strongly, apparently, for VLTs. So does that mean in the next sitting of the House they're going to stand up and be all for VLTs, Mr. Speaker? It's the way the Liberals have flip-flopped on this issue about pension benefits is simply emblematic of what we've come to expect from them. I'd also reminded members the other day, Mr. Speaker.
I'll member Cape Breton West on the point of order.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order, clearly I've tabled the evidence that was requested by the honourable member during his assertions and his crackling on Friday past, and all of a sudden now he's speaking about matters that are not related to the bill. And I would ask, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, if you'd rule and ask if the member would probably either deal with the matter that was tabled before the House here, where all the employees at HRM support this particular piece of legislation, or at least come back to the principle of the bill.
Well, thank the honourable member for Cape Breton West for his assistance in that. Certainly, I'd ask the honourable member for Halifax Fairview to stick to the point at hand. The bill is present before the House. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview has the floor.
I certainly will, Mr. Speaker. I certainly know what the Liberals are touchy about. That's for sure. And of course, this bill wouldn't be before us now, Mr. Speaker, if the government did have some confidence that the Liberals had changed their position since the spring. But one of the other things that I'd asked all members to consider in my remarks of the other day was a question to which no member on that side of the House had an answer, and a question to which no member on the third-party side of the House had an answer, Mr. Speaker. And it's the question that you would think would be the most fundamental, basic question any member of this legislation would ask when a bill of this kind is before us, which is, who exactly is losing pension benefits as a result of this bill? Mr. Speaker, which workers at which companies in which constituencies are losing benefits as a result of this Liberal-supported bill? You'd think that before we pass a bill taking away pension benefits, we would at least know the answer to that question. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister has not been able to provide an answer. He had the opportunity the other day and passed up on it. which means one of two things, of course. There are only two possibilities. Either he doesn't know, which is a matter of great concern, or should be to this House, or he does know, but he's not telling us. And that should also be a matter of great concern, Mr. Speaker. And as a result of diligent research by the NDP, Mr. Speaker, I would like to let the House know what we've been able to find out since I spoke the other day about who exactly is losing. Because, Mr. Speaker, I don't feel it's terribly responsible of me to vote on a bill stripping away pension benefits till I know whether people in my constituency are being affected and what they think about it, Mr. Speaker. So, as a result of diligent research, I would like to suggest this partial list of companies whose employees are losing pension benefits, real dollar amounts, as a result of this bill. This is only a partial list, Mr. Speaker. I don't claim that this is a complete list. Mr. Speaker, first, Stanfield's. Whose riding is that in? Okay, Stanfield's employees are losing pension benefits as a result of this bill. How did they feel about this bill? Has anybody asked them? Do we know? I don't know. I would think that the government would want to ask the Stanfield's employees. Emera, the former Nova Scotia Power, which now happily goes by the name Emera, which, unlike Nova Scotia Power, the name Emera doesn't mean anything to anybody, but that's what it is.
Order, please. All member Cape Breton West on the point of order.
I beg the indulgence of the House here, but clearly the member who claims he's done all his research on this particular bill would know quite clearly from the legislation that's on the books that Emera is exempt from this particular piece of legislation, either present or contemplated.
On the point of order, but it's a disagreement of facts between two members. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, it's unclear to me how it is that the member supposes that Emera is exempt from this legislation, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, he's very diligent about raising points of order and tabling documents, so let him table the documents. If it's true, I'll withdraw it. I'll withdraw it in a second, Mr. Speaker. So if this doesn't apply to Emera, so much the better. It'll take a great weight off all our minds. Okay, Emera, how many of us, Mr. Speaker, have Emera employees living in our constituencies? I know that I do. And these employees are losing a real benefit as a result of this bill. How did they feel about it, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, third, Stanfield's, Emera, Michelin. Michelin employees, now if I remember rightly, we have 3 Michelin plants here in Nova Scotia. There's one in Pictou County, one in Waterville, I believe I'm right in saying, and one in Bridgewater. Okay, which ridings are those in, and where do the employees of those 3 plants live? Now, those employees are losing real benefits under this bill. How did they feel about it? Has anybody asked them? Of course, they don't have a union to ask, but has anybody asked the Michelin employees how they feel about losing these benefits? Do they support this? Maybe they do, Mr. Speaker. Maybe they do. But I would think that the members in whose riding those workers live would want to know the answer to that question before they vote away their pension benefits. Another one, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Association of Health Organizations, which is probably, apart from the district health authorities, the largest employer of health care workers in the province. Those workers are losing benefits as a result of this bill. Now, how many members in this House have NSAHO employees living in their constituency? I know that I do. How do they feel about this? Has anybody asked them? Don't you think it would be prudent for us to know the answer to that before we vote away their benefits? I certainly do, Mr. Speaker. So what's the real issue, or what's going on here? Because whenever a government says that they're trying to do one thing, but they're actually accomplishing another, you have to say, well, what's the real issue? Well, I don't think there should be any doubt that pension plans throughout Nova Scotia, throughout Canada, are under pressure. Okay, because of the performance of the markets and the level of interest rates, some of them are in difficult financial circumstances, some more so than others. And when a pension plan is in difficult circumstances, it has essentially 3 choices. It can do something to increase investment returns, which is easy to say and hard to do, or it can call on all of its stakeholders, the employees and the employers, to increase contributions. Another possibility, which is not very popular with plan members, Mr. Speaker, I know that for sure. And the third option, essentially, is to cut benefits. Those are your three options when your pension plan is having some difficulty. And in some cases, all the pension partners may agree that what they want to do is cut benefits, and that's fine. I don't think any member of this House wants to stand in their way when that is, in fact, what's happening. So why, then, does this legislation apply to all plans in Nova Scotia, all plans, when it appears that we're only aware of one plan that meets those conditions that I've just laid out, namely that all the pension partners have agreed that, having weighed all the options, that what they want to do is deal with their financial problems by cutting benefits, namely cutting out the grow-in provisions. Why then are we not dealing with that one plan? Why are we dealing with all plans in Nova Scotia? It's a bit of a mystery, Mr. Speaker. And of course, I'm talking about the Halifax Regional Municipality. And more broadly, what HRM pension stakeholders are talking about may, I underline that, may be applicable to all municipal pension plans in the province, or it may not. We don't have any information before us to prove that one way or another. But if HRM is the issue here, why isn't this bill dealing with HRM? As I said the other day, Mr. Speaker, if this House can consider and pass a bill conveying a 30-foot strip of land in Tatamagouche, then it can deal with exemptions for this particular plan or that particular plan, provided they meet conditions laid down by this legislature. And it appears that by any reasonable test, Mr. Speaker, HRM has met the test.